In the next 10 minutes, I'm going to discuss the death of constitutional money, the Constitution's very wise relationship with gold and silver, and the warnings that we've left unheeded for generations. Now, since Nixon decoupled the dollar from gold in 1971, the US dollar, as many of us know, has lost more than 99% of its purchasing power when measured against gold. This is despite the fact that prior to decoupling from gold in the early 1970s, our then US Treasury Secretary and Federal Reserve Chairman was making the rounds of Congress, running around telling them months prior that the US dollar would strengthen once we decoupled from gold. Now, they also said that gold would weaken dramatically, but since that time, gold is up over 8,000% on a secularly climbing pattern, as this chart makes very clear. But actually, gold is really not rising at all. It's just that the fiat dollar is falling by such an amount. In fact, when you look at a chart of the falling dollar for that same period since 1971, it's really an inverse to the chart of the rising gold price. Now, this undeniable inflation or debasement of the currency has brought temporary prosperity in the stock markets, but it's really brought permanent ruin to that unit of account by which Americans measure their wealth, the US dollar. Of course, the correlation to Fed money printing and the rising inflating stock markets are really now beyond debate or controversy, as this chart makes pretty objectively, empirically clear. But many are forgetting that even the money being made by these bubble assets is just money with less purchasing power with each passing day, month, and year. Such debasement of the currency to inflate broke nations out of debt at the expense of the citizens' financial stability is really nothing new. Now, these kind of hidden thefts preceded the downfall of Rome in the 3rd century or the violent revolution in France in the late 18th century. As David Hume warned as far back as 1752, or as von Mises from the Austrian school warned in the 20th century, debt destroys currencies, and hence debt destroys nations. With the US now at $39 trillion in unsustainable debt, can it really be an exception to history? Well, the answer is not at all. It can just take longer for the dollar to decline, and this is because the dollar is a world reserve currency, so demand for that dollar is literally embedded in the global petrodollar markets, the international FX reserves, the eurodollar markets, the international derivatives trade, the international SWIFT payment systems. Each of those would take hours to discuss separately, but as John Connally had said in the early 1970s, our Treasury Secretary, at that particular time, it was our dollar and the rest of the world's problem. But since the US weaponized that dollar in the Putin sanctions of 2022, again, whatever you think of that, our dollar is now our problem, as the world is clearly de-dollarizing, and there's a massive rise of new dollar trade settlement systems and even a decline in the US petrodollar markets, all of which, again, are separate complex topics, but all of which point to a world moving away from a distrusted and debased US dollar. Gold is now openly preferred over US treasuries by the global central banks, and they in fact own more gold today than they do US treasuries, and the amount of gold stacking by the central banks has gone up 5x since we weaponized the dollar in 2022. In short, the dollar is declining, and we can debate the DXY measurements or the relative strengths, DXY up, DXY down, milkshake theory. We can do that all day long. The dollar is not going to die, but it is going to be repriced, regardless of its fluctuations on near-term headlines. So the big question now is, how did this happen? How did the USA not have any written guidance or any warnings or any regulations or controls or wise men to prevent such a massive wealth transfer and such a wealth shift hiding now in plain sight? But in fact, we had precisely such a warning and such a document, and it's called the US Constitution. Now, its founding fathers, however flawed, were aware of the history of sound money. They were also very clear about who should control the supply of that money to prevent its debasement. And that's why in the very first article of the US Constitution, Section 8, it gives that power to Congress only. Now, of course, Congress gave that power to the Federal Reserve in 1913. That too is another topic altogether. But as for our founding fathers, that was never the plan. Hamilton and Jefferson debated that. And as for the states themselves, Section 10 of that same first article of the US Constitution says that the only money they had the power to coin was to be in gold and silver. It's very explicit, as the founding fathers were explicitly worried about the financial chaos that would come from paper money. This warning was also underscored and addressed under the U.S. Articles of Confederation. So this, again, was not unknown to our founding fathers. It made it very clear that the only real money was to be gold and silver. Its authors were equally driven, and this is important, by the principle that this document must protect the governed from the governing. They wanted a document to protect the people from the inevitable financial and social disasters which would come if paper money were ever expanded to the point where it was little more than open theft by the governing over the governed. After all, inflation is just an invisible tax, and all Americans and many of the British know that Americans don't like taxation without representation. But what we have with inflation is exactly that. Now, if we fast forward some 250 years since this seminal document was signed in 1789, we find ourselves and our dollar in the very chaos and invisible tax which our founding fathers warned against. When it comes to the sound money principles, our Constitution today is little more than a museum piece. And so how did this constitutional money die? How did the U.S. get to the current kind of, and frankly, anti-constitutional, increasingly worthless paper money system it's in today? Well, sadly, the answer is very simple. It's because desperate governments, like desperate people, do desperate things. And the first cracks in our constitutional money kind of arrived during that all too desperate period of the U.S. Civil War. That's 1861 to 1865. Now, of course, wars are expensive. We understand that. And when the gold ran out in Abraham Lincoln's Washington, D.C., it was not a surprise that the U.S. decided to issue temporary greenbacks, that is, paper-backed rather than gold-backed dollars. And that was used to pay down desperate military debts from a very desperate Civil War. Was this constitutional? Well, on its face, of course it wasn't. But the always clever Supreme Court, in what was then known as the legal tender cases, argued that those inflated greenbacks could be temporarily allowed so long as the paper money was not seen as legal tender or a store of value, and that the government would eventually repay those greenbacks back in gold. Of course, we all know now that whenever policymakers use the word temporary or transitory, whether it was Nixon or Bernanke or Powell, we should start to worry. Of course, after the Civil War came the Resumption Act, which resumed, as its title implies, a gold-backed U.S. monetary system. And that was passed by the same Supreme Court. But that Supreme Court was then asked once again to interpret the Constitution's otherwise very clear guidance as to gold and silver as money. But what did the Supreme Court do after the Civil War? Actually, they began to backpedal. The court declared that D.C. actually could issue greenbacks if it wanted to, with or without a war, or as the excuse or the pretext. But they said not to worry because the war's over and we've got everything back to normal and money is now gold and silver backed, so don't worry. But again, not for very long. Fast forward and enter FDR's and the New Deal era of 1933 and the gold confiscation and the flagrant dollar revaluation that followed. And what followed, we know, at that period was then what was then an infamous but now totally forgotten piece of Supreme Court decisions called the Gold Clause cases, where the Supreme Court said there was no longer any need for a gold parity between the U.S. Treasury and gold because the U.S. dollar in 1933, they said, was just as valuable as silver. So who needed any such clauses or guarantees in our IOUs? Of course, that was just a lie. Again, the Supreme Court can be very clever with the laws. They're just not so clever with sound money and economics. This is the politics of the legal system. But the slow frog-boiled death, of course, of constitutional money in the U.S. would finally come to its end in 1971. The suspense was over when Nixon officially decoupled U.S. money from constitutional money and U.S. money from gold. And the world would finally come in August of 1971. So we no longer had a gold chaperone. And like the Supreme Court era of the Civil War period, Nixon famously declared that this decoupling would only be temporary. And of course, now 55 years later, we know that too was just a lie. So here we are with the fall of such paper money, but it should not be of any surprise. It should be of zero surprise to anyone in 2026 for the tragic reason that it was of no surprise to our founding fathers, our Constitution's founding fathers in 1789. They literally warned us then of our own crisis centuries later. And by ignoring, bending, and hiding such warnings in the many decades since, the net result has been tragic. The very country this Constitution sought to protect from inflationary debt, tyranny, desperation, centralized controls, stablecoins, CBDC, unnecessary wars, and obvious currency destruction, now finds itself in a blender of each of these tragic yet historically foreseeable circumstances. It kind of reminds me, sadly, of John Adams when he walked outside of the Constitutional Convention and said the following: "There was never a democracy that did not commit suicide." Now, as the evidence suggests, this suicide has taken place slowly over time and really a death by 1,000 legal and political cuts. Had we stuck to the letter, spirit, and intent of the very Constitution that defined our money in precious metal terms, such debt would have never metastasized this fatally high, and the fall of our nation and dollar would have never sunken this embarrassingly low. Now, in short, the Constitution matters, and it mattered then and it matters now. But most who pledge allegiance to it at every political swearing-in ceremony, left or right, have likely never read it, as their predecessors had effectively already killed it. But just because a long history of political and economic opportunists, as Hemingway says, would no longer constitutionally protect our money with gold, this doesn't mean that we cannot do it ourselves. So if you want to save in paper money or preserve your wealth in paper money, that, of course, is your choice. But our founding fathers, as well as England's David Hume in the 1750s or the Austrian school's Ludwig von Mises, warned it was much wiser to save in a monetary metal, a precious metal like gold and silver. Now, of course, centuries of history confirm that they were right.